Well, how do I prepare a sermon? Well, I start off with a blank sheet of paper in front of me and I let thoughts come flooding through my mind, and hopefully at the end of that there will be something written on the sheet of paper. So when I sat down to prepare for this morning, I just let a whole lot of memories come flooding into my mind. Now let me make one confession. I have no military experience whatsoever. I was too old by 1 week to do national service. I've never fired a gun or a rifle in anger or in non-anger. My connection with World War I was my father, who was a returned soldier, and he was the best kind of returned soldier. His boat left Auckland on the 10th of November 1918, and it did a U-turn on the 11th of November and came back to Australia. My memory of World War II is the police rounding up the Italian greengrocers in Campsie because they were considered to be a national threat. I remember the Japanese plane that flew over our house in Sydney, hit by the searchlights. It was a reconnaissance plane for what was to be next day the shelling of Sydney Harbour. I remember the announcement on the BBC News, something that I didn't think was terribly important, that the Americans had dropped a fairly big bomb on a place called Hiroshima and that a lot of people had been killed. I had a cousin who was taken prisoner in the Second World War and spent the war in Changi. I had a cousin who was a navigator and flew many missions over Germany and stayed in the RAAF after the war ended, and in 1950 was killed in an air crash on Lord Howe Island. If you've been to Lord Howe Island, the remains of that plane are still there. They've left them there. I remember the celebration of the end of the war. I remember our church praying for some of the people in the church who'd gone off to war. And I remember vividly a conversation I had with a pacifist. He said to me, "You know, John, I was in jail with people who were there for taking life, and I was there for refusing to take life." One of the ironies. I remember Mac. Mac was a member of the first church that I was at in Sydney, and it was several months before I knew that he had artificial legs. He was in a trench and a shell landed there and his life was saved, but his legs were lost. And he spent his time going to visit people who'd had similar experiences with losing their legs and trying to help them. So there it is. That's my experience of war. But I think one of the most impressive things about the service today and any Anzac Day service you've been to is the silence. In the book of Job, we read that one of his comforters, Eliphaz, talks about a dream that he had and then says, "There was silence, and then I heard a voice." Silence and then a voice. And that is characteristics of some of the special moments in spiritual history. In the beginning, the earth was a formless void. There was darkness over the deep, a brooding, unfathomable silence. And then a voice. let there be light. Elijah on Mount Hebron, the earth trembles and then a storm and then silence and a still small voice. We've just come through Good Friday and the figure on the central cross has not spoken for hours, just silence, and then a shout of triumph. It is finished. So what voice spoke to us this morning in the silence? Well, certainly the voice of the past, the voice of memory. We will remember them. And certainly the voice of sacrifice, men and women who were in love with life and yet they died in the mud of Flanders and the beaches of Gallipoli and Normandy, in the desert and in the jungle. And most of them were very vague about political theories, but they were clear about this. The enemy had to be defeated if the things that really matter were to be preserved. Today we remember the sacrifice of others and ask ourselves how we're using the gifts that were brought to us at such costly price. I remember two things from a visit to France. One was we went to Villers-Bretonneux, and as we walked up to the Sir John Monash, I guess it's a memorial, there were these crosses, row after row after row of them. And there was this old man. He was 24, and the rest of them just young men. And then a little village in the south of France called Forces, and there was a memorial for the First World War, and it talked about les enfants. And I thought, why are they remembering children? But they weren't. They were remembering the 16-year-olds, the 17-year-olds, the 18-year-olds. And I guess the voice was the voice of duty. We have a duty to those who died. It's not fulfilled when we've had a minute's silence, but only when we have dedicated our lives to others. I wonder what one of the soldiers who died in the war coming back to our land would see today. Would he see less selfishness and more consideration, less prejudice and more tolerance, less greed and more cooperation? Today we remember those without whose sacrifice our lives would be so different. And then as I kept on writing down things, I wrote down a verse from the Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, is a very frightening document. Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called the children of God. We will pray for peace today. And I remember when I first went to Burnie in Tasmania, it was during the Vietnamese War, and the ministers had decided that they would have prayers every Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I went with 3 other ministers and no one else. What do we mean when we talk about peace anyway? I'm sure that some of you, most of you who are parents, would at some time or other have said to your child, for goodness sake, give me a bit of peace. And what are some of the answers to peacemaking? Refuse to fight? Well, people on both sides of that argument. But we live in a world where there is racial tension, and closer at home there is domestic violence. And I wonder, are we at peace with ourselves? God, the Gospel says, has made peace with us. St. Paul says, for he himself is our peace. God has accepted us into his family, and you and I have accepted this message. But we cannot claim to have peace with God as long as we are in a divided world, as long as there are hostile groups, as long as we refuse to recognise that our neighbour, whatever his or her nationality or belief, is one with us. This is through the reconciliation that Jesus has made. So the peacemaker is the one who takes the initiative, who breaks the circle of hostility, who is ready to share in the cost of reconciliation. One of my favourite hymns, not in Together in Song, but it's in the Baptist hymn book. It says this: let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be. With God as our Father, brother and sisters are we. Let us walk with each other in perfect harmony. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow, to take each moment and leave each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Amen.